Nightwing should never be Batman. Dick Grayson first appeared back in 1940 as a way to add levity to Batman's dark character. It was a way to uplift Batman and to appeal more towards children. Historically, Robin has always been the type of character that Batman needs to have around to remind him what it means to have compassion, to remind himself that his war is not never ending and that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and that he is making people's lives better at the end of the day. Robin is a helpful reminder of that. Robin helps to ground Bruce. And that was a majority of Dick Grayson's role for as long as he was Robin. But eventually Robins grow up. Robin is typically a moniker held by the younger generation of the Bat family, because eventually the characters move on and become their own. Cassie became Spoiler, Tim becomes Red Robin, Jason becomes Red Hood, and the first to ever do it, Dick Grayson, becomes Nightwing, one of the most celebrated and beloved characters that DC has, and to reduce Nightwing into nothing more than the next guy up to take the mantle of Batman is not only doing an entire disservice to his character, but it is also doing a disservice to the identity of Batman. It's funny because when I was a kid, I vehemently remember absolutely adoring Nightwing's little run in the early 2000s as Batman, and I firmly believed that, oh, Dick should just remain Batman. I was kind of oblivious to the idea that being Batman was not only taking an extreme toll on Dick Grayson, it was also erasing parts of the character that I loved so much. And multiple great adaptations of the character understand this fact extremely well. And I want to look at a few of them today, namely his limited run as Batman in the comics, his appearances in the DCAU, his appearances in Young Justice, and of course the DCAMU. But before all of that, I think it is extremely important we explain why Robin left Batman, why he struck it out as his own hero, and why being Nightwing is so important to the character of Dick Grayson. Throughout Dick's entire time as Robin, he sees himself as Batman's sidekick, and for the most part, eventually wants to grow up into being Batman. He almost idolizes Bruce. I mean, how could you not? You lost your parents, and the man that adopts you is not only rich and not only uses his money to genuinely help people, but he is also risking his life every single night to save the people of Gotham and being a hero in doing so, and has offered you the ability to do so yourself. He almost idolizes Bruce. And this goes on for a while until Dick Grayson eventually realizes the kind of struggle and obsession it takes to be Batman. That tends to be part of the tipping point a lot of the times, is the way Batman has to carry himself to do his job properly, the secrets that he has to keep, the lies that he has to constantly spew to other people. It's the methods that Batman has to use to extract his information. It's the interrogation, it's the brutality of being Batman. But that wasn't really the tipping point. My favorite Nightwing origin for reference is Nightwing Year One, and that firmly involves Dick and Bruce eventually getting to a point where not only have all of those issues cropped up, but also the fact that Bruce doesn't respect Robin at that time as his own hero. Nightwing had been asked by Bruce for some help with Clayface, and during that time, he was dealing with some Titan stuff, so he ends up being a little bit late. And Bruce just loses it. This has been a culmination of years of pent-up and somewhat hidden animosity between father and son that just boiled over into one really bad moment. And so Dick, looking for advice, goes to Superman, who gives him the story of a hero called Nightwing. And this finally allows Dick Grayson to break free and to finally set his own path as his own hero, not only to break the shadow of Batman, but also to break free of the curse of what it means to be Batman. Think about all of the characters who have to inherit the mask at some point. We see a lot of dystopian futures with Damian Wayne, and he seems pretty miserable in most of them. And, well, there's Terry McGinnis, and we see what happens in Epilogue.
I've told you 100 times. That's a risk I'm willing to take.
I'm taking the choice out of your hands.
What are you saying?
I'm saying we're done.
Because at some point you have to think about what it requires to be Bruce's version of Batman. So Robin breaking free and setting a life for himself as Nightwing, setting an entirely new precedent for what it means to be a hero, and also setting a precedent for what it means to be himself, to finally step outside of the shadow of Batman and step out of the burden. It is highly important to his character, and he is wildly different from Bruce. He likes to joke, he likes to play around. The way in which he likes to extract information is almost entirely different. Rather than just beating you to a pulp or scaring you half to death, it's just not his style. Dick really likes working in teams. He loves the Teen Titans. He loves having teams around him and support systems of people. Bruce, not so much, at least at this point in the timeline. Eventually, you know, big Bat family stuff, and I'm going to address that later in the video. And I think that's a good little prehistory of the character, especially if you're walking in a little blind or a little fuzzy for why he chose to step out of being Robin. And that brings us to 1990, in which we get to see, obviously, everybody's favorite Bane story, Nightfall, and some would argue his only good story. During Nightfall, Batman is training his successor, that being John Paul Valley, aka Azrael, trying to break Azrael's coding. Just to keep it simple, Azrael was in a cult. The cult liked to kill a lot of people and to make their people into assassins. Batman didn't like that. He was trying to break John Paul Valley out of the assassin's code and mind control bullshit, and he was going to have him set up to be the next Batman. Interim Batman, as Bruce just had his back completely broken, but John Paul Valley goes crazy, he starts killing people, programming kicks back in, and eventually Dick is forced to take up the mask. Although a lot of Dick's run as Batman during this short intermission is done through the Robin comics, specifically Robin Volume 2, and gosh, those are hard to track down, I won't lie. But his entire time as Batman is spent being almost spiteful. Even though Dick never wanted to be Batman and wanted to step out on his own, he was still almost insulted that Bruce never even asked. And when Bruce was ready to come back, he was more than willing to give up the cowl because he hated being Batman. And that's something we see echoed in the 2009 run of Dick Grayson as Batman. Battle for the Cowl. Throughout that entire miniseries and somewhat collection of different Battle for the Cowl, it was made very, very clear throughout that story that Nightwing did not want to pick up the mantle of being Batman. And it wasn't really his thing. And yet, by the end of the mini-series, he is forced to, because Jason basically picked up the mantle of Batman and just started going on a mass murder spree. And it doesn't help that Tim also tried to pick up the mantle as Batman, but ultimately got his ass folded by Jason, which really only leaves one character because Damian is far too young to be Batman. That leaves Dick Grayson, and since he was the only option, he picked up the cowl. And now I'll be completely honest with you. I absolutely loved that little short run, that 26-issue run between Damian and Dick. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I enjoyed it because it was temporary and it should be temporary. Because throughout the entire story, it's clear that Dick doesn't want this to be long-term and that being Batman is ultimately harmful for him. I often think to this panel, which isn't actually a part of the Batman and Robin run, but rather Life After Death, wherein which Grayson has to take down Jeremiah Arkham and stop his entire insane plot. Dick Grayson had to give up parts and pieces of himself and become far more like Bruce. He had to become Batman, and he wasn't being himself. And I wish I could offer you like a really substantial and cathartic ending to this where Bruce comes back from being lost in time, because yes, that's where he was. Shout out Omega Beams, I guess. And Dick Grayson hands over the mantle, he goes back to being Nightwing, and he realizes that Batman is not for him, and that he shouldn't have to be the one to take up the mask in the future. Except the entire universe gets rebooted thanks to the Flash, and we get the New 52 instead. And so on that unsatisfying note, I would much rather give you a few more satisfying looks into why Dick Grayson either never becomes Batman, or when he does, he ultimately chooses to give it up. Starting with the DCAU, which I think is arguably the most depressing end for a Batman story I've ever bared witness to. Throughout the DC animated universe, we have seen that version of Batman, while compassionate, while caring, while being, for the most part, a good guy, is very cold to the people around him. It's as though all of his compassion is funneled strictly to those who need it as Batman and as Bruce Wayne, but not to those around him that truly need him, not to Alfred for a decent amount of time, and especially not towards Dick Grayson, especially when Dick sets out to be his own character and to be Nightwing during Old Wounds. We see that Batman not only actively keeps the fact that his girlfriend is a superhero a secret from him, but we also see that Bruce is becoming more violent. He is becoming more almost animalistic in the ways he deals with criminals, and that doesn't sit right with Dick Grayson. This is not how he remembers being trained to be Robin. And all of that culminates and boils over, and years of being stuck in Batman's rearview mirror pushes Dick into finally leaving and going off on his own. And when he does, Batman isn't exactly all that sympathetic to him, nor really that great with Dick relationship-wise, even as they meet up multiple times for the new Batman adventures. To the point that Tim is the one trying to mend the relationship more than anything else, while once again also questioning why Bruce would bring in another young protege just after having Nightwing, somebody that I believe Tim was younger than Dick when Dick picked up the mask in this show, something that doesn't sit right with him even as he sees Tim to be competent. And when we do eventually get to the far-off future, we don't even hear about Nightwing at all. As a matter of fact, Bruce Wayne is left alone. Tim eventually gave up the mask and went to go be a normal person after the whole Joker kidnapping brainwashing incident. Barbara Gordon also gave up being Batgirl after that incident and ultimately ended up being the Commissioner of Police, someone who is not very fond of vigilantes due to her time with Bruce. I don't really remember hearing about Dick or Nightwing at all throughout any of Batman Beyond, but I may be missing something from the tie-in comics. And instead, the only thing we're left with for a successor for Batman is Terry McGinnis in that universe. And as much as I love Terry, this world is bleak and extraordinarily depressing because Batman is alone. He burned all of the bridges around him. We even have an entire episode where the beginning is him reminiscing about all of the loves of his life that he missed out on because of his life as Batman and the rules he has to follow while doing so. I'm gonna presume Dick went and gotten himself a good life outside of the mask, because that's always something that he seemed like he wanted. And that brings me to my next interpretation of the character, and arguably the one I'm most familiar with, and the one you've heard me talk the most at length about: Young Justice's version of Dick Grayson. From the start of Young Justice, it was always a show about teenage superheroes, mainly sidekicks, stepping out of the shadow of their mentors and finally starting to make names for themselves not only as heroes, but as genuine equals to their mentors and to their partners, to show that they were actually ready to be these heroes. And the ages varied, but Dick Grayson was by far the youngest on this show. He was 13 years old, but even at 13, he displayed a high level of emotional intelligence and a high level of understanding what it means to be Batman. And the showrunners fully understood this, especially in season 1. Dick was always the guy making jokes, he was always the guy having a good time, and even though he took it wildly seriously, he was always trying to keep an upbeat manner, as he usually worked with Batman, who was very, very stoic in this show from everything we were able to see at the time. And throughout all of this, eventually one day Dick came to the realization that he didn't want to be Batman. The obsession, the drive, the absolute will that it takes to be Batman, the things you have to be willing to do in order to don the cape and cowl, the contingency plans against your own allies, the ability to lie so easily. Dick didn't want anything to do with any of it. And he made that very clear. And Bruce even said it himself. He didn't want Dick to grow up to be Batman. I've played those two quotes more times than I can count on this channel, And they're also like the two biggest quotes from the show, in my opinion, when it comes to any sort of online discourse regarding either character. So instead, I want to shift focus a little bit to the second season and beyond for Dick. Because we do get a time skip in that show, and we do get to see how Dick Grayson would handle being Nightwing. And ultimately, he doesn't handle it well. The thing that I love and loathe the most about this version of Nightwing is that he damn near ends up being exactly like Bruce. It's a tragedy in a way, because we're looking at a character who has so often been against wanting to be like Batman, wanting to step out of Batman's shadow, to be a hero that is brighter, that is bolder, and that has a history outside of being Batman, and one that is more compassionate, one that doesn't require you to beat the information out of your criminals, one that doesn't require you to be fueled by anger and hate and loss and sorrow, one that doesn't define you by the tragedy you experienced when you were a child, but that allows you to accept it and to grow from it as a person, something that Bruce was never given the ability to do. And he's unable to do that in Young Justice. Because in order for him to run the team, he has to lie. He has to do the exact same things that got Bruce into trouble. That same level of obsession Bruce had with the mission, Nightwing has with the mission. Throughout season 1, we often saw characters in their casual clothes, and we did see that as well in season 2. Characters relaxing, having a good time, being in their civilian outfits. Never once is Dick Grayson in his civilian costume in season 2. He is always suited up, always on go. And even Bruce had his fair share of moments in that first season where he was outside of costume. But for the most part, he was in that costume, and he took being Batman as his full-time permanent job. Nightwing is almost never seen outside of his costume. He is never seen relaxing, and we spend a decent portion of the show with Nightwing. He is always on go, always in his costume, and he has accepted that this is his life. His life is being the superhero. His life is running the team, which means he had to lie to his own teammates for the benefit of taking down the light. He had to keep secrets that were dangerous and sometimes outright harmful to those around him, specifically to characters like Miss Martian, to Aqualad, to Superboy, and all of that eventually eats him up from the inside out, because he realizes he became the very thing he never wanted to be. And so ultimately, when Dick Grayson decides to leave the team and leave Nightwing behind, and the show gets canceled, I always envisioned when he would eventually pick up the mask, because Nightwing is who Dick Grayson is, he would be more like his comic book counterpart. And season 3 brings that a little bit, but to be full honest with you, he still is just kind of Batman light in that show, with jokes and humor, but in his actions, it doesn't separate him the way Nightwing separates himself in a lot of other media from Batman. And that's something that always bugged me, and something I think the 4th season of the show actually did a really better job at. But something that always bugged me was there was almost this disconnect between season 2 and season 3, like he didn't grow very much from all the secrets and the lies. It's like he didn't learn a lesson, but I'm gonna chalk that up to there's like a decade between those 2 seasons. So I'm just gonna give them a slight pass. And that ultimately leaves us with the only version of Nightwing that we've seen in an adaptation on screen to actually take up the mantle of being Batman. And that was actually in the DC AMU, which surprisingly spanned a lot of movies. From like 2014 with Son of Batman, or technically you could call it 2013 with the end of Flashpoint, the movie, all the way until like 2020, I believe. It was either 2020 or 2019 with Justice League Dark. And those movies had a lot. They had so much time to not only build out the Batman mythos, the Superman mythos, they had a lot of time to cover different concepts. And while it started as a bold-faced ripoff of the New 52, it eventually morphed itself into its own kind of continuity, and that's something I really liked. The costumes got a little bit more comic booky. The stories they were willing to tell like opened up and became more broad, rather than just sticking to like New 52 type of stuff. So I found that really enjoyable. And Even though I'm not a huge fan of Batman Bad Blood, it did give us a look into Dick Grayson being Batman for the first time that wasn't in a comic book. And it's during his time there that we get to see the dynamic between him and Damian, which had been building for a few movies at that point. And it was really fun and enjoyable. But throughout the entire experience, Dick makes it clear, this isn't who he is.
I've struggled for years to get out of Bruce's shadow, to build a life for myself as far away from his world as possible. And the last thing I want is to be wearing this damn thing.
And when he has to don the mask and be Batman, it's very clear that he has to act differently than he does when he's Nightwing. It is less joking. It is taking the job. I don't want to say more seriously, because Nightwing takes this seriously, but just darker. He has to be darker in the way he carries himself, in the way he talks to criminals, in the way he has to deal with everything surrounding being a superhero, because that's the goal. I've gone over this a lot in this video already, but it's just great to see this adaptation specifically tackle his time as Batman, rather than just showing us Robin and Nightwing. It was really cool, even if the movie was not so great. So, with all of that said, I don't think Dick Grayson should ever don the mask as Batman, at least not for a permanent run. I don't think the succession line should look like Dick Grayson in the slightest. He has made his entire life good. He has a good life outside of being a superhero for the most part. He has this honestly pretty decent work-life balance when it comes to being a hero. He doesn't feel like he has to be as dark and as brooding and as scary as Batman. He wears bright colors, he smiles, he makes jokes. More of his face is visible, and I think that's a key distinction between the two characters that I wish I had touched on earlier. When you see Batman with his full cowl, it is about being less human, it is about being a symbol of fear. But with Nightwing, you see a majority of his face. He is not trying to scare his criminals. He's just trying to protect his identity, and so he allows them to see that he is human just like them. And I think that's just a really cool aspect of the character. And so if Dick isn't going to be in the line of succession, then who should be? A lot of people will say Terry McGinnis, and as much as I love Batman Beyond and as much as I love Terry, the character fundamentally does not work with mainline comic book Batman. Why? Because in order for Terry to be the next significant Batman, Damian cannot exist. And if Damian can't exist, then he also has to ruin his relationship with a majority of the Bat family, to be left alone and to be old and to be crippled and on his own with no help. He has to separate himself from this amazing support system he has. And I think I speak for a lot of the fan base when I say we love Bat Dad. We love when he has good relations with the Bat family, and that helps to uplift Bruce and it helps to build him up rather than break him down. And for Terry's story to work for the most part, you have to envision a world where Bruce has no one around him. Because let's be real, if anybody's taken up that cowl, DC has made it abundantly clear. It's Damian. It's not only his birthright, but it's also the thing that he wants the most. And I think Deceased did it absolutely beautifully, having Damian take up the mantle of being Batman. And so that leaves us with Damian. It's probably the only right answer if I'm gonna be so for real. I also was writing this script well before the most recent comic came out revealing that, and spoiler here, so all of my thoughts for the rest of this video are done in case you don't want to hear this. Tim Drake is revealed as being Batman Beyond in this most recent comic run. And I mean, way to hoe Terry, let's start there. But outside of that, if anybody was gonna be Batman Beyond, I would have put my money on Tim too. Tim just kind of got it like that for real. So if it's not gonna be Damian, it's for sure gonna be Tim. And I see all of that happening well before Terry gets the nod, unless this is an alternate universe, as much as I love Terry. So anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Okay, time to do the YouTube thing. If you liked the video, please leave a like, helps out the channel a lot. If you disliked the video, please leave me some constructive criticism in the comments down below. It helps me to be a better creator for all of you. If you want to sub, it's free. You can always unsubscribe later. Helps the channel out a lot. I do have a Patreon, which for $1 a month, you can see these videos without all the changes that I have to make for YouTube. It just is where I get to put my full creative passion, and I absolutely love having that. As well, you can join the Discord, and if you're in the $5 above tier, I shout your name out at the end of each and every one of my videos. So without further ado, shout out Athena, Ethan, The Real Medusa, Gramir, David, Kane Kent, John, Demetrius, Metal Monk, West Belladonna, Oscar, McGann, Esabert13, Gabriel LaFonte, Video Gamer 75, Dakota Ross, and Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You all are amazing. Hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.